The tanker had been sailing without incident for hours when it suddenly changed everything. No warning signal, no communication with the fleet, no formal request. The vessel, known as Rich Star, quietly shifted its heading, pushed its engines harder, and moved deliberately toward the American enforcement line cutting across the Strait of Hormuz, as if the entire blockade were nothing more than a suggestion written in water. Aboard a nearby American warship, every sensor on every screen activated at once. What followed in the next several minutes transmitted a signal that traveled from Washington to Beijing to Tehran with the force of something unspoken but universally understood. Not because of the oil in that tanker's hull, not because of its destination port, but because of who ordered it forward and because of what happened the moment the most formidable naval presence ever assembled in that narrow corridor responded. Immediately, completely, and without a single moment of hesitation. China had probed the blockade. America had responded to the probe. But here is the part that nobody in the mainstream conversation is discussing. The tanker reversing course was not the defining moment of that encounter. The defining moment was what that reversal exposed. A confrontation that has been quietly assembling beneath years of trade negotiations, diplomatic performances, and carefully constructed press releases from Beijing. For the first time in living memory, the gap between what China claims it is capable of and what China can actually execute was laid bare in full daylight on the most scrutinized shipping lane on the planet. And the consequences of that exposure stretch far beyond a single vessel making a U-turn in open water. To fully grasp why one tanker changing course carries this kind of weight, you need to understand what Beijing and Tehran spent the past 15 years building between them. Because the American blockade did not simply halt Iranian crude exports. It severed a carefully engineered strategic architecture that both governments had invested enormous resources in, constructing, and that China had come to depend on in ways that went far deeper than the price of oil. China is Iran's dominant trade partner and its single most important energy customer. But the relationship was never purely transactional. Iran offered Beijing something with a far longer strategic value than a discounted barrel of crude. It offered geography. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China embedded itself into Iranian infrastructure, gaining particular leverage through Chabahar Port, a maritime gateway that effectively bypassed the traditional American-influenced trade corridors entirely. In return, China gave Tehran something equally indispensable: technology transfers, infrastructure financing, diplomatic protection inside international institutions, and perhaps most critically, an informal network of tankers that moved Iranian oil to Chinese refineries under the radar of Western sanctions, keeping the Islamic Republic economically viable through years of maximum pressure campaigns that would otherwise have brought the regime to its knees. The two nations had engineered a system, a continuous flow of oil, revenue, and strategic cover running between them through channels that Washington could threaten but had never managed to fully shut. Iran needed Chinese demand to remain economically functional. China needed Iranian oil to stay affordable and needed its Middle Eastern foothold to remain geopolitically credible. And then on a single morning in April 2026, the United States Navy dismantled that entire system before breakfast. Karga Island, the engine room of Iranian crude exports, the transit point for roughly 90% of what Iran sells to the world, locked down. Chabahar, Beijing's carefully cultivated alternative gateway, sealed. Bandar Abbas, the entry and exit point for virtually all Iranian maritime trade, brought to a standstill. Every corridor through which China had been quietly absorbing sanctioned Iranian oil was closed simultaneously, without warning and without appeal. The Belt and Road's Iranian corridor became operationally worthless overnight. Billions of dollars in Chinese infrastructure investment sat stranded with nowhere to send its output. The diplomatic protection Beijing had offered Tehran through multilateral organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization became irrelevant because the problem was no longer being debated in conference rooms. It was being resolved by 3 carrier strike groups, 15 warships, constant combat air patrols, and submarine coverage operating in waters that China had no practical capability to contest. 190 million barrels of Iranian crude loaded and ready aboard tankers drifting at sea with no viable destination. Years of strategic construction cut in a single morning, but even that dramatic rupture was not the moment that fully revealed the depth of Beijing's dilemma. That moment came when China decided to find out whether the blockade was genuine or theater. Rich Star approached the enforcement corridor and made its move. Within 20 minutes, it executed a full reversal. Two additional tankers, Asteria and at least one other, followed the same sequence in rapid succession. Three vessels with Chinese connections turned back from the American line without a confrontation, without a standoff, without a single weapon being fired, just a course change and a message received. Chinese Defense Minister Admiral Dong Jun then stepped to a podium and delivered words engineered to project authority. He said Chinese vessels had passed through the strait. He said Beijing maintained binding agreements with Iran. He said the United States had no right to obstruct Chinese maritime activity, commanding language. Broadcast through every state media channel in China and circulated through diplomatic networks across the globe. And yet, not one ship was protected by those words. Not one tanker moved through the corridor that Dong Jun had implied China possessed the resolve to defend. The distance between the statement and the reality on the water was visible to every naval command, every intelligence service, and every government tracking this situation in real time. That gap between what Beijing says and what Beijing does is precisely where the most dangerous miscalculation of this entire crisis now waits. China's problem here is not simply the loss of Iranian oil. In isolation, that loss is painful but survivable. Beijing holds an estimated 130 days of strategic petroleum reserves. It can draw them down. It can approach alternative suppliers at significantly higher cost. It can absorb the immediate shock expensively but functionally. The real problem is the Strait of Hormuz itself, and the numbers lay out exactly why. China moves over 10 million barrels of oil through the global maritime system every single day, almost entirely by sea. Approximately 40% of that supply transits the Strait of Hormuz. Not just from Iran, from Saudi Arabia, from Iraq, from the United Arab Emirates, from Kuwait, from Qatar. Added together, and roughly half of China's total seaborne energy supply depends on that one narrow passage operating without obstruction. As long as the US Navy controls those waters, China's energy security exists in a very direct and immediate sense at the discretion of American decision makers. That is not a strategic condition that a country positioning itself as a genuine global power can accept indefinitely, not for an economy whose entire industrial base, manufacturing output, and political stability is built on reliable and affordable energy. Not for a communist party whose domestic legitimacy rests on delivering uninterrupted economic expansion to 1.4 billion people who have been told repeatedly and with great confidence that their nation is ascending to co-equal superpower status. This is why Rich Star's reversal carries consequences far beyond the cargo it was transporting. It was a moment China's claim to genuine peer competition with the United States, a claim a decade in the making, was tested on open water against actual military reality and came up short. So what does Beijing do now? This is where the crisis enters its most consequential phase, because China has options and none of them are good. The first is direct military confrontation. Can China project naval power to Hormuz to break the blockade by force? In theory, yes. China has an established overseas military base at Djibouti on the East African coast. The People's Liberation Army Navy has expanded dramatically over the past decade, with port infrastructure reaching from the Horn of Africa through the Indian Ocean toward the Persian Gulf. But Hormuz represents a completely different strategic environment than anything China has stress-tested its forces against. The assembled American force, 3 carrier strike groups anchored by the Abraham Lincoln, the Gerald R. Ford, and the George H.W. Bush, more than 15 surface combatants, F-35C and F-A-18 fighters maintaining continuous combat air patrols, P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft surveilling every surface contact, submarines operating below the waterline, over 50,000 military personnel embedded across the theater, represents a concentration of military capacity that China's Navy cannot match in that geography under those conditions. At this moment, a Chinese warship forcing the blockade line means direct kinetic engagement between 2 nuclear-armed states at sea. The last time the world experienced a dynamic remotely similar to this was October 1962, when Soviet cargo vessels approached the American naval quarantine line around Cuba. That confrontation is remembered as the closest humanity has come to nuclear war. The analysts watching this crisis are invoking that comparison deliberately. China is not positioned to risk that confrontation, not with Taiwan tensions already running high, not with its economy absorbing the compounding damage of American tariffs, not in a theater where American military dominance is overwhelming and unambiguous. The second option is the playbook Beijing has refined in the South China Sea, gray zone tactics, Coast Guard vessels instead of warships, civilian maritime militia rather than military assets, presence without the threshold for open military engagement. Beijing could attempt to route commercial tankers through the strait under quasi-governmental escort. manufacturing a non-military corridor through implied deterrence. This approach works against Philippine Coast Guard cutters and Vietnamese patrol boats. It does not function against 3 American carrier strike groups. If China assembles a gray zone convoy and the United States stops it, the bluff is called in front of the entire watching world. The entire multipolar order narrative that Beijing has been constructing for a decade collapses in a single incident broadcast live. The third option is China's most comfortable arena, diplomatic and economic leverage. Beijing holds a permanent UN Security Council veto. It can construct international opposition. It can weaponize supply chains. It can accelerate sales of American treasury holdings. It can cut American access to sectors where Chinese manufacturing dominance creates genuine pressure points. But none of these tools opens the strait. Diplomatic mechanisms operate on timelines measured in months. Chinese refineries are operating on timelines measured in days. A Security Council veto does not move oil into a tanker. And China's economic retaliation cuts in both directions. Escalating the trade confrontation damages China's own economy at the precise moment it is already absorbing the energy disruption caused by the blockade. The fourth option is what Beijing is visibly executing right now: patience, damage absorption, making others hurt more while accepting a painful share of the suffering. China has already suspended gasoline and diesel exports, squeezing Japan and South Korea and undermining regional economies that depend on Chinese fuel reprocessing. It has quietly resumed purchases of American liquefied natural gas, reopening imports. It had theatrically canceled, attempting to create diplomatic breathing room through economic engagement, even as the military confrontation intensifies. It is simultaneously positioning itself as the indispensable fuel supplier to Southeast Asian nations scrambling for alternatives, expanding its regional leverage while its own energy situation deteriorates. China is hurting, but it is engineering conditions where its rivals hurt more. And it has calculated, at least for now, that patience is less dangerous than escalation. The fifth option is the one requiring the most time, but carrying the most enduring consequences: building permanent alternatives to Hormuz. The China-Pakistan economic corridor running through Jawara Port could theoretically move Gulf oil into China overland, bypassing the strait entirely. This crisis has demonstrated the strategic necessity of those investments with a clarity that years of planning documents never achieved. But those corridors cannot yet approach Hormuz's volume capacity. They are a long-term solution to an emergency that is measured in weeks. Every path carries an enormous price. Beijing is calculating, not acting. And that space between calculation and action is the single most important strategic revelation this crisis has produced. On the American side, the force assembled at Hormuz represents one of the most consequential naval deployments in the modern era, and it continues to grow. The Abraham Lincoln Strike Group is at full combat readiness in theater. The Gerald R. Ford Group holds position in the Mediterranean within rapid response range. The George H.W. Bush is approaching, and upon its arrival, the United States will have 3 complete carrier strike groups simultaneously committed to a single operational zone, a concentration of sea power without modern precedent. Over 50,000 personnel, dozens of the most advanced surface combatants ever constructed, uncontested air supremacy maintained continuously around the clock, submarine coverage layered beneath every surface engagement zone. There's no comparable force within range of the Strait of Hormuz. There is no combination of Iranian fast boats, coastal missile batteries, and proxy drone swarms that creates a credible conventional threat against this density of American power. But American power at Hormuz is not infinite. Understanding its limits is essential to understanding how this eventually resolves. Sustaining 3 carrier strike groups in a single theater indefinitely is logistically punishing. Aircraft carriers require continuous maintenance rotations. Personnel cycles constrain extended operations. Ammunition and fuel logistics for a force of this scale represent substantial ongoing commitments in their own right. And every asset concentrated at Hormuz is simultaneously unavailable in the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, or the Baltic, other potential flashpoints that are watching this crisis with intense calculation. Allied support has also been considerably thinner than Washington anticipated. The UAE and Bahrain have declared support. The United Kingdom stated explicitly that it would not participate in blockade enforcement, restricting itself to mine clearing and humanitarian navigation security. Germany and Australia declined involvement entirely. France is conducting its own independent navigation operation alongside the UK, explicitly detached from the American operation. The United States is managing the most consequential naval operation of the 21st century in substantial isolation. And the blockade itself, while operationally effective, is not hermetically sealed. Vessel tracking data confirms that at least 7 Iran-linked ships have transited the strait since enforcement began. 3 of them were under active American sanctions. Washington appears to be making deliberate judgments about which vessels to intercept and which to let pass, a selectivity that reveals both the practical constraints of enforcing a blockade across one of the world's busiest maritime corridors and the political calculations running beneath every enforcement decision. Rich Star turned back on its first approach. It transited on its second attempt. The blockade is real. The blockade is functioning. But the blockade is not absolute. And that space between official policy and operational reality is where China probes, tests, and applies pressure every single day. Iran's position in all of this has undergone a transformation so complete it would have been unimaginable just 2 months ago. For decades, Iranian strategic doctrine rested on a single irreplaceable pillar. The credible capability to close the Strait of Hormuz made the Islamic Republic untouchable. The threat of closure deterred military action against a country that could not match American conventional power. The actual closure delivered leverage over every economy on earth that depended on Gulf oil. Hormuz was Iran's weapon, its deterrent, its existential insurance policy. Since Operation Epic Fury began, that leverage has been systematically dismantled. Iran's air defense architecture collapsed within the opening weeks of the campaign. Over 100 coalition aircraft penetrated Iranian airspace, struck central Tehran, and returned to base without a single loss. Underground facilities described for years as impenetrable were penetrated by B-2 bombers carrying bunker-busting munitions designed for exactly that purpose. The Bushehr naval base was destroyed. The IRGC command chain was severed. Senior intelligence officials and operational commanders were killed. The logistics network supplying Hezbollah and the Houthis was disrupted. Iran closed Hormuz, sent oil prices surging past $150 a barrel, triggered fuel crises across Europe, created genuine economic shock across Asia, and paralyzed significant portions of global shipping, proving that its ultimate deterrent was not a bluff. And then America answered, not by reopening the strait and restoring the previous balance, by taking the strait away from Iran entirely, clearing the mines systematically, establishing a protected navigation corridor, opening it to global commerce, and simultaneously locking every Iranian port behind a blockade that stops oil from leaving while allowing all other traffic to flow freely. The strait is open for the world. It is closed for Iran. Iran wanted to punish the global economy by shutting Hormuz. America's answer was elegant and devastating. We are opening it, but you are staying inside. Iran's own weapon turned against it. Iran's own strategic logic reversed and executed with superior force against the country that invented the tactic. What options remain for Tehran? Theoretically, several. In practice, almost none worth taking. Laying new mines requires small vessels operating in waters now under continuous American aerial surveillance and surface patrol. A conventional naval breakout from Iranian ports is impossible with Bushehr destroyed and the fast boat fleet severely degraded. Striking Gulf state energy infrastructure would permanently push Saudi Arabia and the UAE into full alignment against Tehran and deepen regional isolation to a degree incompatible with regime survival. Activating proxy networks through Hezbollah and the Houthis simultaneously would expand the conflict in ways that provide American justification for military responses far beyond anything already executed. Every option makes Iran's position worse. Every day the blockade holds, the economic pressure accumulates irreversibly. The oil storage clock is running. The $13 billion monthly revenue loss is compounding. The well shutdown timeline is approaching. And the domestic economic crisis that has already brought Iranians into the streets in numbers that came close to toppling the regime is about to become catastrophically more severe. And so we arrive at the question that every government, every military command, every trading floor, and every energy market on the planet is asking simultaneously, how does this end? 3 possible futures are now in play. The one that materializes will be determined by decisions being made right now in Beijing, Tehran, and Washington. The first future is diplomacy. Iran returns to serious negotiations with a counter-proposal built on the framework presented in Islamabad. The nuclear question is addressed in language that allows the regime to claim a face-saving outcome while conceding the core demand. China's quiet pressure on Tehran, pressure Beijing cannot acknowledge publicly, but is escalating daily as its own energy security deteriorates, tips the calculation toward a deal. The blockade is lifted, a framework is signed, the strait returns to normal operation under international supervision. This is the future Washington has engineered its entire pressure campaign to produce. Every element of the blockade, the $13 billion monthly squeeze, the oil storage countdown. The economic isolation is designed to make this future the only rational choice available to Tehran. The second future is escalation. Iran activates the Houthis. The Bab el-Mandeb, the second most strategically critical waterway on Earth, is disrupted simultaneously with Hormuz. A Chinese convoy attempts the blockade line with quasi-military escort and creates a confrontation that neither Beijing nor Washington can fully control once it begins. The ceasefire collapses, military operations resume under a tightened blockade, oil prices breach levels that trigger a genuine global recession. The conflict expands beyond every boundary any party originally intended. This is the future nobody in any of these capitals wants. It is also the future that becomes progressively more probable with every day that the diplomatic window narrows. The third future is prolonged standoff. The blockade holds but does not force Tehran to the table quickly enough. American logistical sustainability comes under strain. Allied support continues to fail to materialize. And China keeps probing the blockade with sanctioned tankers, a portion getting through, maintaining a thin trickle of Iranian oil that extends Tehran's runway slightly. The crisis grinds forward without resolution, inflicting escalating economic pain on every party involved, restructuring global energy markets around alternatives that take years to build, and leaving an entire region permanently scarred by a confrontation that nobody could find the exit from. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 lasted 13 days. It ended because one side blinked. Because someone in Moscow looked at the American naval blockade line, assessed the military reality of what waited on the other side of it, and made the judgment that the cost of pushing through exceeded anything that could possibly be gained by doing so. In 2026, the same fundamental equation is unfolding in a different strait, with different actors, different weapons, and different ideological stakes, but the underlying logic is identical. Military power is drawing a line. Diplomatic channels are the only path to a resolution that does not end in something catastrophic. China's tankers turned back. China's defense minister delivered commanding statements that could not protect a single hull from changing course. Beijing calculates, but it does not take risk. And that choice, that deliberate conscious decision to hold back from the line, may be the single most consequential variable determining whether this crisis finds an exit or becomes something the world no longer has the capacity to contain. The distance between words and action defines the real architecture of power in the 21st century. In the Strait of Hormuz, that distance is being measured in real time. One tanker at a time, one enforcement decision at a time, one day at a time. As the oil storage clock counts down toward a moment that changes everything. Hormuz is no longer Iran's weapon. Hormuz is now Iran's cage. And the world is holding its breath, waiting to see who blinks first.